some of the changes to the protocols that we talked about. I think we didn't talk as much about that we are going to be working on scheduling surveys kind of down to a day. So we'll work with the teams on the breeding beaches to work on that. So if you see Micah mentioned, you know, scheduling surveys, we'll be working with you on that. So Micah, I want to open the floor to you, and you can take it away.
Right on. Awesome. Can everyone hear me okay?
Yeah. Yes.
Perfect. That's what I want to hear. All right. Hi, everybody. Micah Ashford. Thanks for the warm welcome, Kirsten. Just as a heads up, I'm actually in the Arcata field office, not Seattle. So I'm in Northern California. But I am the Fish and Wildlife Service Western Snowy Plover range-wide lead, and as well as the lead for Recovery Unit 2, which is all of Northern California. Basically, my job is to get the snowy plover up to the required criteria in order to be delisted from the Endangered Species Act. And so I'll share some of the successes of the species, and then get into the meat of my presentation, which is discussing our permits process and how you guys can get your work done and we can get our work done at the same time and increase our collaboration. So just a little quick background on Western Snowy Plover, some fun taxonomy. We'll start off talking about where they are in the cladistics world. So snowy plover are obviously in the animal kingdom, and it's because they have a backbone. They're a chordate, so they're in the phylum Chordata. And then they're a bird, so class is Avis. But then we get into the more fun stuff. So they're called charadriiforms. That puts them on pretty much any sort of pelagic or bird that lives near water, and that includes seagulls. Are also charadriiforms. So it's kind of a very large group of species, but that's your kind of your shorebirds, essentially. And then their family are Charadriidae, and that's going to be all of your plovers and your lapwings, killdeer, etc. And then they're in the genus Anarhynchus. This was a recent change from Charadrius. Charadrius was this like mixed genera or genus of all these different taxa that weren't necessarily related to each other, but people that are in taxonomy didn't quite know where to put these individuals so they just kind of grouped them into this like multiple category genus. That's been spread out now, and so snowy plovers share the genus Anarhynchus with the Kentish plover in Europe. Kind of fun. And then lastly, the species name, which is Anarhynchus nivosus. And the species as a whole in the United States makes up about 30,000 birds, but there is an interior population and a coastal population. So the coastal population, which you can see here in this image on the left-hand side, does not intermingle except during the winter months with the interior population, which makes them genetically distinct and isolated from each other. So if the interior population were to wink out of existence, the coastal population would not repopulate the interior, and vice versa. If the coastal population were to become extirpated or removed, then the interior population would not reestablish a population on the coast. And so they do intermingle in the wintertime. So in the winter months, the interior population will come to the coast, and the coastal population will sometimes move to some of the interior lakes or on the coast of Mexico. Kind of fun. We're split into 6 recovery units that ranges from central Washington all the way down to Baja, Mexico. And the 6 recovery units just help us kind of determine what population each of those recovery units needs to attain in order to get delisted. It also helps. We have a site-specific manager within the Fish and Wildlife Service that manages each of those recovery units. So along with the range-wide lead, I manage Recovery Unit 2, which is Del Norte, Humboldt, and Mendocino counties. All of y'all, with all of the work that you're doing in Beach Watch, are in Recovery Units 4 and 2, 4 being from Sonoma to Monterey counties. So that's a quick rundown of snowy plover from taxonomy to why we have the distinct population segment that's listed under the Endangered Species Act on the coast. So a recent update, which is really exciting, is that last year we do a twice annual survey for snowy plover on the coast. And last year's breeding window survey, which is done in May, found over 3,000 individuals. 3018 to be exact, which is the first year that the species has reached the minimum population in order for delisting under the Endangered Species Act. So it's a huge success for the species. We've never had this many species, this many individuals on the coast before. And so we're seeing this kind of year-over-year increase that's been happening, which is really exciting to see. In Recovery Unit 2, there were 103 birds found, and then in Recovery Units 4, there was 347 birds found. So a substantial number of the part of the population is definitely in the areas where you do your surveys. Looking over time, there's some R-squared values on the right. Basically, the R-squared value just shows you how related the two axes in the graph are, right? So if you have a value of 1, it means like a 1-to-1 relationship. So this R-squared value is a way for us to track the strength of the growth or decline across all of the 6 recovery units. And what we've found since conducting these window surveys since 2005, that snowy plover populations in all the recovery units, but 4 and 5, are increasing. So we're seeing year-over-year increases in the population due to our various management activities that we conduct. And in RUs 4 and 5, we are seeing flat population. In other words, no population growth nor decline, which is good. Usually they're staying relatively stable in those locations. Okay, so that was the fastest rundown of their population trends and their taxonomy. Now I want to talk into a little bit about their habitat characteristics. So snowy plover on the coast prefer open sandy habitats with natural dune backs or natural dune vegetation, where that rolling sand and wind forces can manipulate the landscape in a way that is more open and natural, right? These are really dynamic systems, and they require a lot of movement to stay relatively healthy. And plovers definitely pick up on sites that have that. They rely really closely on cover objects. So anything that they can use as a windbreak and still provide 360 degrees of view shed to be on the lookout for predators or potential rivals is preferred. And they also like native vegetation because, again, I mentioned that dune ecosystems are natural processes that are naturally moving by, coastal winds and also plant communities to kind of promote a constantly changing environment that is affected by those, abiotic and biotic factors. They also like it above the high tide line. Now, if you encounter plovers on the beach, you may encounter them during both the non-breeding and the breeding season in the rack line, which is usually where the highest high tide brings all of the vegetation in. And then as the tide recedes, there's that vegetation line, and that's called rack, right? And so those are full of highly nutritious organisms for the plovers to prey on. And they will also use the objects above the high tide line in that rack line as, like I said, as windbreaks or as refugia or camouflage. And so you'll often find them just right there. Other species like sanderlings tend to stay right against the water line as the water's moving up and down. Plovers generally tend to stay away from that. You can occasionally find them running along the water line and foraging, but generally most of their foraging activity is going to be spent in that rack when the tide is receding. The breeding season for snowy plovers runs from March 1st to September 15th. This can vary by site. I kind of blotted out this sign a little bit. I just really like the Oregon sign. And that date can change slightly based on where you are in latitude. In places like San Diego County, you can get breeding activity as early as February 1st. Here in Humboldt, our breeding activity usually starts sometime around mid-March, and we usually get our first set of nests at the end of March. But as a general rule of thumb, and what is listed in the recovery plan is that the breeding season officially starts on March 1st and then ends on September 15th, unless there are additional chicks that were late nests, and then the breeding season will run until those chicks fledge at that particular site. So it could be beyond September 15th sometimes. Snowy plovers rely on crypsis or camouflage to lay their eggs, produce their clutches, and rear their chicks. So their eggs and nests are very camouflaged. They don't build nests like traditional bird species do. Usually the male will make what's called a scrape in the ground, where he just digs out a little hole in the sand, and he'll make sometimes as many as 50 to 70 of them before a female picks one that she likes. And when they find one that they like, they'll begin to decorate it with little bits of sticks or pebbles or shell. And you can see in this top right photo some of the decorations that they use for their nest cup. After they decorate it, the female will lay a single egg. A couple days later, she'll lay a second one, and then a couple days later, she'll lay a third one. And she won't start to incubate that entire nest until the clutch is complete. So the first egg that's laid often just stays dormant for about 5 days before it gets any incubation at all. Pretty interesting. Okay, once they begin incubating, they will incubate for almost exactly 28 days, and then the nest will hatch. The eggs hatch asynchronously of each other. So sometimes the first egg will hatch, and then maybe up to 2 days later, the other two will follow. What I've generally found doing this job, I find that the first egg is usually the early one, and the other two are usually around the same time. Both sexes will incubate the nest. The general rule of thumb, which isn't always the case, I've seen them not follow this at all a lot, is that the females will incubate during the daytime and the males will incubate at night. But I often see them switching in the day or at night. So it really does seem to be more of a misconception, but maybe 50% of the time that's the case. But they will both tend the nest. And then as the chicks hatch, the female will leave and go find another male to initiate another nest with, leaving the male to raise all 3 chicks by himself. So again, the male raises the chicks, and then we'll tend them for the 28 days it takes them to fledge. So 28 days to hatch, 28 days to fledge. Here's some examples of some nest photos. This is a really prime example of a plover nest. They love to put their nests in places that are either surrounded by vegetation or driftwood or rocks. And that increases their camouflage and also a little bit of refugia from the environment, especially the wind. Here's a really good example. Plovers are super cryptic, and if you weren't looking for those eggs, you would never see them. On our beaches in Humboldt, I'm really fortunate that we can rely on tracking to help us find plover nests. We literally follow the plover tracks, and they lead us to nests. On sites that are more commonly with cobblestone or rock, you do not have that luxury, and it makes finding their nests incredibly challenging. Often relying on behavioral cues from the adults on where their nest is located. So the chicks are precocial, and what that means is that when they hatch, within a couple hours, they are up and out of that nest cup and running and foraging on their own. The male, as he's raising them, does not feed the chicks. He just keeps them warm and watches out for danger while the chicks run and forage on their own. So again, it does not take long. This chick, you can see, still has the egg tooth at the front of the bill, and that means that this chick is probably less than a day old. They usually lose that egg tooth within 1 or 2 days. Here's a very short, quick video. As you can see, these chicks, again, just freshly hatched. They're pretty clumsy at first, but once they get moving, they are up and they are quick. So when we do anything like color banding or any sort of measurements on the chicks, we need to get them before they get up and running, because we're not going to catch them otherwise. So the males exhibit what's called brooding behavior. So he uses different calls to either alert the chicks to danger or call the chicks to a location. Maybe there's forage available for them, or to bring them in close for warmth. And so he'll use different calls to call them around. And he'll do what's called brooding. So, this chick is getting up next to the male, and he'll actually ruffle his feathers and stand over the chick and keep it warm. And sometimes, you can see a male with like 3 pairs of legs sticking out from under it. And that's because the chicks are underneath it getting warmed up. Males are also very, very attentive parents. So when there's a predator or, a human or a pet dog out in an area, the plover will go straight towards that danger. It will tell the chicks to hide. And so the chicks will go and hide somewhere. And then he will go and give what's called a broken wing display, like he's giving here, to distract the predator away from the chicks. And so that's a very common tactic they use. They'll also do something called tail dragging, where they'll take their tail feathers against the ground and just kind of run in a direction to make it look like they're deeply injured. And that's to just lure the predator away from wherever the chicks are being cached. So that's a real quick rundown of their kind of life history during the breeding season. Again, the 28 days to incubate and then 28 days to fledge. And then once the chicks are flight capable, they then separate from the adults. So let's talk a little bit about the threats that the species is facing and why this distinct population segment, this coastal population, is listed under the Endangered Species Act. The largest threat to snowy plovers and their chicks and eggs is predation. And, they're a very small bird in a very exposed environment. And so at times it can be very easy for these predators to locate and predate on these, individual plovers. The largest predator by far across the entire range is ravens. We are in a point in this year where over the last several decades, raven populations have increased to a level that is beyond what is normally considered healthy. So although ravens are native to North America, they act almost as if they're an invasive species because their population levels are so high. And that's really due to the interaction with the human environment. Ravens do incredibly well in human-dominated landscapes. They're incredibly intelligent. They're incredibly ambitious foragers. And so in places where other bird species might not be able to do well, ravens can thrive. And so in places like agricultural landscapes, cities, that human-dominated environment, ravens have increased to a level we've never seen before. Because of that, and because plovers are often adjacent to human-dominated landscapes, plovers are often the victim of raven predation, generally through the form of predating the eggs and chicks, not necessarily the adults as much. Another predator that's very common across the range is skunks. As far as mammalian predators go, skunks are definitely the highest on the mammal list. And then to a lesser extent, foxes, coyotes, dogs, feral cats in places that are more on the urban landscape. And then other avian predators such as hawks, peregrine falcons, northern harriers, great horned owls, etc. So I have a few videos to show you just to kind of show how voracious and challenging managing ravens can be on the snowy plover landscape. So here is an example of a raven predating a snowy plover nest. And what they'll do is sometimes they'll eat the egg at the nest cup. And then they'll come back the next day and they'll take the second egg. They'll come back the next day and take the third egg. Sometimes they eat all 3 eggs at the nest cup. Sometimes they'll take an egg and then an hour later come back and take a second. And so usually when they find a nest, that raven is going to predate all the eggs. Here's what we have is called a mini exclosure. This is a common predator management tactic we employ to keep ravens out of snowy plover nests. And then here's some other examples of what snowy plovers encounter on the beach. Loggerhead shrikes are a common snowy plover predator in southern areas like Los Angeles or San Diego County. Okay, here's another example of a plover being attacked by a great horned owl. This plover was saved by a mini exclosure. So you can see the plover in the mini exclosure begin to freak out. And the great horned owl hits the mini exclosure instead of the plover, which allows it to escape. Okay, so some of the challenges that snowy plovers encounter on the beach. Oops. Okay, some of the other problems that snowy plovers face, besides predation, are habitat loss. And this is due to a number of factors. The phenomenon that we call is a coastal squeeze. So basically, we have things like invasive species such as European beach grass and ice plant, very common, creates a stabilized dune network. They were literally brought in in the 1900s to stabilize the dune ecosystems for development. And unfortunately, dunes require, they're a dynamic ecosystem. They require constant movement. And when you stabilize these ecosystems, you end up getting what's called scarping. And so eventually what happens is that as that beach grass holds the dune system in place, those high tides we get in the winter, the king tides, end up washing pieces of the dune away till eventually that dune is actually taken away and disappears. So it's, eliminates the habitat for plovers that way. And then we have coastal development by humans, creating things like cities or agriculture, you name it, any type of development, neighborhoods, also pushes, snowy plovers on the opposite side, right? So we have and then we have erosion and climate change. So sea level rise coming up on the other side. So you really have forces acting on both sides of the snowy plover habitat, which then squeezes them into more and more, smaller locations where these high density plover numbers are nesting, which could then attract predators. So here's an example of European beach grass and how their root systems go super deep, and it stops the dunes from, performing their natural processes that they would otherwise with a native vegetation mat. And this is one of the sites that I survey at here in Humboldt County. Other threats, unfortunately, are people. We do the best we can to, cohabitate with species, but sometimes it does create conflict. So, this can be through the attraction of predators, through leaving our trash in places where snowy plovers are, nesting or overwintering, having loose dogs on the beach that could potentially chase snowy plovers or kill them. And then also, things like equestrians and OHV or off-road vehicle use. You can see here in the tire tracks, there is a snowy plover nest just to the right of it that almost got run over. In Humboldt County, we get at least 2 to 5 nests a year that get run over by off-highway vehicles. And then, of course, just other types of recreating, right? If we're at a site, we may be unknowingly pushing a bird away from its nest, and then that could cause the nest to fail. It could cause the parents to abandon the nest or cause them, delay or slow the development of the chicks, which could increase their predation risk. So one thing I also want to remind everybody too is when we're out on the beach doing our surveys, snowy plovers see us the same way they see a coyote or a skunk or a raven. They view us as a predator. And so whenever we're out there, they're going to be doing the tail dragging, the lure display, the broken wing display, hiding their chicks. They're going to be behaving as if we're also out there to eat them. And they're going to respond whenever we enter their nesting habitat in the same way. So we do a number of things across the range to help mitigate some of these threats. And we have sort of a number of tools that we use to help snowy plovers recover and coexist with humans and the other threats that they encounter. So the first thing we do is regular monitoring, right? We won't know how to respond to the threats that these species are facing without knowing what's going on with their population status. So we go out oftentimes with spotting scopes and binoculars, and we try to minimize our presence out there to count nests, count the number of hatches, and then as they go through their raising process, how many juveniles are fledged. And that gives us an idea of productivity at each of those sites. We also have different predator management tools, such as mini exclosures, which I had discussed earlier. A mini exclosure is basically just a little cage you put over the plover nest, so that predators cannot get in, but the plovers can get out. And so it's a way to keep predators away from nests. That tool is used at some sites and not at others. We also have something called symbolic fencing or plover protection areas. Here's me with a couple of my interns in 2024 setting up a plover protection area or symbolic fence at Tolowa Dunes State Park in Del Norte County. And then we also have predator management. Mini exclosures are one of those tools for predator management, but we also do things like hazing of predators out of sites. There are sites where we do lethal removal of certain predators, and then, other ways that we can sort of mitigate the effects. And so then we also have outreach and education. And I would also argue that that is a predator management tool as well. And so we attend campfire talk programs in California. We give talks at places like Godwit Days here in Humboldt County. And I'm sure some of you have maybe interacted with some of the national parks Bark Ranger program. That's the similar ideas. So with monitoring, we also use color bands as a sort of a mark recapture tool to help us assess the productivity and success at nest sites, and also track migration patterns and movements of birds across recovery units and sites. So banding is done usually with 4 color bands with 2 on each leg, and they're usually banded as they hatch. This is a chick that I banded last year. So it gives us an idea of the left leg, gives us the project location, and then also a unique individual identifier with the right leg. And again, like I said, it helps us track their movements, gives us an idea of fledge, and then is great for tracking birds through the winter season as well. So with all of that, there is, this is a very heavy-handed approach, right? We're putting color bands on birds. We're going into their sites to monitor them. And so we're doing all of this with a lot of training that helps us avoid take. So the definition of take under the Endangered Species Act is any attempt to harass, harm, pursue, hunt, shoot, wound, kill, trap, capture, or collect, or any attempt to do any of those activities is referred to as take. And take is basically anything that could detrimentally impact an individual or the species as a whole and prevent recovery of that species. So we want to avoid take as much as we can. So in order to limit the amount of take that snowy plover surveyors do, we go through a very intensive training process in order to get what's called a 10A 1A recovery permit or an incidental take permit. And that's issued by the Fish and Wildlife Service. And it's, it shows us proper survey technique, how to avoid making sure that our footsteps don't attract predators to nest sites as we go to look at nests, how to when to band, when not to band, how long we should linger at a site so that we don't, attract predators to that location, etc. So it's a very intensive process that we undergo in order to get permitted, and that allows us to minimize the amount of take that is incidentally accrued when we do these surveys. So, but this is what allows us to, as the governing body, to authorize people to conduct work in snowy plover areas. And so without a recovery permit, without owning or having a 10A 1A permit in your name, there is no take authorized for any other type of survey or work on beaches where snowy plover are present. So because of that, with Beach Watch, we can't ask every one of you to undergo the amount of training that's required to be on a 10A 1A recovery permit and pay the $100 fee associated with it. So instead, we need to make sure that the actions that the Beach Watch monitors are doing when they're collecting their very important and vital data doesn't harm or negatively affect plover. So we want to make sure that any actions that Beach Watch or any other monitoring agency collecting data on snowy plover sites conducts their actions in a way that doesn't cause take. So if take does occur and it's potentially, a repeated violation, or we find that there was intent behind it, someone pursuing snowy plovers for whatever reason, it will immediately trigger a potential ESA investigation. And that's when we get law enforcement involved, and it turns into this whole thing. And I don't like doing it. And we try to avoid that at all costs. So what can we do? Well, you all will be conducting your surveys during the breeding season of snowy plover. And that's when there's, they're pairing up, they're laying their eggs, they're raising their chicks. And we want to make sure that we're out there not causing any harm. So the first thing that you can do is just avoid walking in their habitat. And basically their habitat is anywhere from the rack line up into the dry sand. So if you can walk down preferably at low tide on the wet sand, that is the first thing that you can do to almost guarantee you're going to eliminate almost all instances of take there. So during the low tide, during the breeding season, try to conduct your surveys and stay on the wet sand. That will keep you out of their habitat and give you plenty of room to walk, because the tide will be out, that you'll be able to walk around plovers should you find them and you need to skirt around them or something without causing them to get up or feel distressed. And that's again through March 1st or through September 15th or until the last brood at that site fledges. We also ask that you guys respect symbolic fencing and avoid dry sand whenever possible. So if there's symbolic fencing, please don't cross into that area. That symbolic fencing sometimes has what's called a bump out, and that can sometimes abut the wet sand. And that reason that bump out exists is because there's a nest that's very close to that fence line. So they had to move that fence line further away so that that nest is protected. And then we ask that as you're walking through areas where snowy plover are present, that you move with purpose. Try not to linger. I know you guys have protocol that, is kind of, you kind of have to walk with purpose anyways, but that's just something to be aware of, that, you really want to minimize the amount of time you spend while you're going through the snowy plover areas to avoid any incidental take, such as through inadvertently separating a male from his chicks, or scaring a female or male off of the nest and then they don't return to incubate for some time. I can tell you on my surveys, I've had, snowy plover sometimes follow me all the way until I leave the beach. And that can sometimes be over a mile, that the snowy plover will follow me until I am gone. And then he will return to his nest. And so we want to avoid that as much as we can. Even as a surveyor, I try to avoid that as much as I can. I only approach nests when I have to. And otherwise, I try to give them as much space as I can so they're not threatened by me. Okay. I would also ask to avoid reading or reporting any color bands. I mentioned we use spotting scopes to look at the bands. They're really small. For example, here's one of our metal fed bands, holding up to the camera here. I don't know if you guys see me on the camera or not, but they're very small. And so if you just have a pair of binoculars, you're going to have to get very, very close to read those color bands. And that is going to make the plover run away from you. It's going to cause take. So we just ask that you don't read the bands. If you do see a plover at a site that we're not aware of, we'd love to hear about it, because that means that we could do regular monitoring at that site with some of our 10A1A permitted staff. But you don't need to go as far as reading the color bands, because once we get to that site, we can pick up that up on our own using our spotting scopes. And then also, I would ask that you please work with the land management agencies on the land in which you do your surveys to confirm survey dates. There may be a day where snowy plover surveyors are out there setting up symbolic fencing or putting an exclosure on a nest, and they want to minimize the amount of disturbance. So there may come a time within your 5-day window in which you're conducting your survey that the land management agency is going to ask you to maybe delay or change your survey date. So I'm just asking to please be flexible with that and just be as communicative as possible. So that way, the plover team can get their work done, and then you guys can also get your work done as well. Because, we want both to get done. And so we want to do it in a way that's, just increasing the collaboration between both teams. Yeah. And so I did say that there could be short notice where, we suddenly find a plover nest and we're getting a mini exclosure on it, or we're putting out some symbolic fencing. We may have to ask you to reschedule your survey somewhere within that 5-day window. Okay. So if we can do that, then there's no reason that we can't share the beach with this really awesome species. And, I'm sure when you are doing your work, you will probably see some out there, and they're a joy to see and they're a joy to experience. And I think it's a really cool species that we're sharing our beaches with. And so with that, I want to thank everyone for the time, and I'll take any questions that anybody may have.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Micah. And forgive me for missing that you're actually in California with us.
It's okay. It's okay.
Okay.
Arcata's a small office.
All right. So does anyone have any questions for Micah? Anything that's very specific to how am I going to figure out scheduling for my beach? She'll work with me on that. But any natural history things,
When he talked at the beginning about the count and there were 3,016 or something, is that like adults, chicks, everybody?
That's a good question. No, it's only adults. Thanks for clarifying that. So when we do our winter and breeding window surveys, that's only adults that we're counting. We don't count chicks or juveniles in those counts.
And that's individual adults, not pairs?
Correct.
Thank you.
I was just wondering if he knows off the top of his head how we're doing in the Bay Area, like recent successes or not, yeah, like last year.
I couldn't quite hear that question. I'm sorry.
Yeah, happy to repeat. Do you have any specific information on how the plovers are doing in the Bay Area?
Yeah, it's the Bay Area is really interesting. So snowy plover populations in the Bay Area are increasing. We've seen year-over-year increases, and there are sites that are doing incredibly well. There is a really awesome team in the Bay Area called the San Francisco Bay Bird Observatory, which does most of the surveying out there. They just installed a MODIS network and have been doing a MODIS tag study on snowy plover. Generally, what we find out there is that the populations are increasing. However, there is a unique problem that we face because there is a very limited amount of available habitat for plover. And that habitat also needs to be converted to tidal marsh for, California ridgeways rail and the salt marsh harvest mouse and California least tern. And so often there are recovery and actions that are in place for those other species that actually take habitat away from snowy plover without the ability to create new habitat for that species in that location. So we're in a place where we have, 2 to 4 endangered species that are actually kind of at odds with each other in the habitats that they require. That being said, the habitats that we've designated for plover within the last decade have been very successful. And I owe it all in part to a lot of the efforts that organization is doing in the Bay Area. So we are seeing year-over-year increases. I think it's one that we're monitoring pretty closely because of that risk of pushing them into smaller and smaller habitats because we're having to share that space with other listed species. So it's a unique question. I could probably go on about it for a while. But the short answer to your question is yes, they're doing really well and their population is increasing.
And then just adding to that, so the outer coast, separate from inside the bay, the outer coast does also seem to be expanding, correct? We've seen a number of our beach watch beaches in the last years have become breeding beaches.
That's correct. Yeah. And so what's interesting is in the Bay Area, the interior part of the bay is actually a different recovery unit, but that outer part of the bay is part of recovery unit 4. And so, yes, we're also seeing successes in that northern part of recovery unit 4 that goes all the way down to the Bay Area.
Micah, what number would be a happy number for delisting this bird from the EPA?
It's the ESA. Yeah, great question. It's 3,000. So that's why last year's surveys was such a big deal, because we hit that target. Now there's some other targets that need to happen. So that 3,000 bird minimum needs to be spread out across the recovery units. And I don't have the numbers off the top of my head, but for recovery unit 2, we need 150 birds. Recovery unit 4, I think, needs 500, but I need to check the recovery plan for that. And so although we've reached 3,000 birds, it's disproportionately across some of the recovery units. Like recovery unit 1 has about 600 of those birds, and the recovery criteria for 1, which is Oregon and Washington, is only 250 birds. So there's a little bit of nuance there. And then that average of 3,000 birds needs to be maintained for 10 years. So this would be like year 1 of 10 in that regard. So there are some other criteria that are in there, but the fact is, since we've began monitoring this species in the 70s, not me specifically, I was not alive in the 70s, but we've never counted 3,000 birds before. So it was pretty exciting to see that last year.
That's awesome. I was going to follow up on that question, but I got it covered. Okay, other questions in the room?
Yeah, is there any idea of what
what the species counts were previous to the monitoring, like, just some general whatever verbiage about it?
Yep. Do you want to give? I can give you exact numbers. There was a paper in the 70s, I think 1981. They came out with the paper, and they checked the California population between 1977 and 1980. So it's like each year they did a portion of the coast basically, and they had less than 1,000 birds in all of California. And now we're, in California alone, it's like 2,400 something or so. Like it's gone up pretty significantly since the 70s when we first started counting the species on the coast.
I guess what I was asking is, are there any prior descriptions, say, of large numbers, excuse me, of snowy plovers by people who explored the area?
That's a good question. I actually don't know the answer to that question. That's a great question. I don't know when snowy plover were recorded as a unique species in sort of, European settler history. So I don't know when they would have even been denoted as a unique species and what records would have been. Now, if we're talking about like indigenous peoples, there's not really a lot of historical importance in snowy plover. We know that they were there. We know that they evolved in isolation from the other members of their species, the interior population. But there doesn't seem to be that level of cultural significance like with salmonids or ravens or coyotes, or other species. And I think that's because, snowy plover are cryptic. I think that, there wasn't like a significant like connection to food or livelihood or luck or any of those things that I think that the indigenous communities may have had with some of the other animals that they would have interacted with more regularly. So we know that snowy plover were here, but I don't know what the historic numbers used to be before European colonization. And I think that's just because of the lack of records. But I would also be curious to see what people had mentioned, before when they were first settling this area from the East Coast. So if I can find it, I'll get back to you.
Great questions. I think we have time for one more, if anybody has one. I think people are, yeah.
Micah, I didn't hear who you work for.
Oh, yeah. So I'm with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service.
Oh, okay, good.
Yep.
That's legitimate.
So,
Yeah, I like to think so.
So with the different federal agencies, and Micah, correct me if I'm wrong, so like whales are nested under NOAA, they're NOAA species. So the snowy plover is nested under U.S. Fish and Wildlife. So they are the lead federal group. Everyone else will work with them, and they set are in charge with enforcing all of these pieces.
Very cool.
That's correct. That's correct. Yep. Mm-hmm. Yeah. And some species are managed by NOAA when they're in the water and are managed by us when they're on land, like sea turtles and salmonids. They're managed by NOAA when they're in the ocean, but when they move into the rivers to spawn, they're managed by us. So kind of a unique.
Thank you for that. I didn't actually know. Well, some of that. Okay, awesome. Well, I think we're going to call it there. Thank you so much, Micah.